I want to welcome you to our Adam Smith Week event this afternoon. We want to continue, obviously, having our conversation as we've been about urban economics and planning. And today we're taking a very specific focus on Charleston, right? Charleston, of course, is a beautiful city. It's walkable, it's historic, right? We have people come from all over the country to visit us, and yet we still have several issues that confront us: housing affordability, rules and regulations regarding preservation and such. Today, I'm very excited that we've got a panel to talk about that. But before we get to that, let me just remind you of sort of why we're here. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Professor Peter Calcano, Professor of Economics at the College of Charleston and the Director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. The mission of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process is to advance the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. So we host a whole series of events. Adam Smith Week is just our marquee event every spring, but we do a variety of things to interact with faculty and students. We have faculty research projects. We have regular reading colloquiums with our students a couple of times a year. We have a free market speaker series, and of course, Adam Smith Week. I would encourage you to grab some information about the center. If anything you've done this week or seen this week intrigues you and you want to learn more. We, of course, have our Market Process Scholars and Public Choice Associates, which are our mentoring programs. And these have really sort of become a key focus for us outside of our events. And we've been really proud of the students that we've been able to recruit and participate in these programs. And so, I think it's feedback.
I'm still here. Oh,
yeah, sorry, I got feedback. I thought I heard something. So with that in mind, I do want to actually introduce one of our market process scholars, Riley Haas, who's going to introduce the panel for us today to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'll just start introducing them based on the way they're sitting. So Mr. Graham attended the University of Virginia, where he majored in economics, combining modern advances with time-tested urban principles. He founded the traditional walking neighborhood of New Point in Beaufort, South Carolina in 1992. Since that time, he has participated in building 8 other neighborhoods: the village of Port Royal, Broad Street, Ion, Morris Square, Hammond's Ferry, Mixon, and Earl's Court in South Carolina, and East Beach in Virginia. Mr. Graham is a passionate advocate for advancing human-scaled urbanism. And then here we have Mr. White, graduating from Auburn University with a degree in architecture. Mr. White has worked as a principal architect at Liollio Architecture for over 22 years, where he serves communities through design. He is the longest serving current member of the Board of Architectural Review for the City of Charleston, having served for over 10 years, where he contributes to the preservation and protection of the old, historic, or architecturally worthy structures and quaint neighborhoods which impart a distinct aspect to the city and which serve as visible reminders of the historical and cultural heritage of the city. And then on my left here, we have Dr. Mothorpe. He is a professor of economics at the College of Charleston and chair of the economics department. His research interests include urban, regional, and environmental economics, as well as applied microeconomics. Dr. Mothorpe has published scholarly articles in a wide range of outlets. Some of his recent work includes exploring the political motivations and strategic considerations influencing municipal annexation patterns, as well as the impact of flooding and home elevation on property values. Dr. Mothorpe attended Georgia Institute of Technology, where he majored in applied mathematics and went on to receive his PhD in economics from Georgia State University. And lastly, we have Mr. DeVos, who earned a BS in economics and a BA in urban studies from the College of Charleston. During his early career in consulting engineering, he was involved in nearly 300 commercial, military, and municipal construction projects across the Southeast. In 2009, he turned his attention to economics and philanthropy and now serves as the director of programs at the American Institute of Economic Research. Mr. DeVos is a member of the Historic Mont Pelerin Society and a LEED accredited professional. He recently served a 2-year appointment on the South Carolina Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And I'll hand it over to you guys. Thank you for being here.
I think Riley had the hardest job of the whole afternoon by having to do full introductions like that. So thank you so much, Riley. Yeah, no, you're lucky with that. Well, so we're gonna talk about a variety of things. I suspect we have different people from different backgrounds here with different skill sets and expertises here. So we're gonna have this be a pretty free flowing conversation. But I wanted to kind of show one thing here before we kind of dive into it. A lot of times we talk about shortage of housing or unaffordable housing, and we forget to define the problem. And I wanted to kind of put this in this one graph up here. And this is what a good friend of mine is a real estate agent here in Charleston. And we keep chatting pretty often about the housing stock in Charleston. So how real estate agents view it is if you have 6 to 7 months of housing stock, meaning that if no additional house goes in the market tomorrow and things sell at the same rate, it'll take 6 to 7 months for the last house to be sold. Meaning that's how much inventory you're gonna have on the shelf, right? If nothing else is produced. So that would be a stable market, meaning the housing prices will rise at the same pace as inflation. If you're below 6 to 7 months of housing stock, then you're called a seller's market, meaning that the seller has kind of the control of the price and you're gonna be bidding prices up. So you have a shortage of housing. If you're over that 7-month threshold, then you're kind of a buyer's market, so you have a surplus of housing, and buyers are more in control because most sellers don't want to sit in a house for 6 months as it being sold. So the buyers are sort of in control. So in economic terms, think of 6 to 7 months as being equilibrium. And we haven't seen equilibrium in Charleston since I think 10 years ago, almost to the day. That was the last time it kind of fell after, and we didn't see that for many years before the housing crisis. So we've only had a few years of being a buyer's market in Charleston for the last 2 or 3 decades. So that's a persistent shortage in housing, not subjective shortage, but a nominal shortage in housing, and we see it in the rising prices throughout. So I would love to have a conversation kind of going through here about how to address that and where that kind of comes from and where that stems from. But I want to first welcome Vince Graham up here to chat about what he would like to chat about as we talk about housing here in Charleston and improving where we live. So Vince.
Thank you, Brad.
It escaped.
There.
It escaped.
Yes, I'm being an econ major
Here we go.
or minor.
Is that working? That's working. There we go.
What?
So, yeah, first I'd like to establish my credentials. This is me with my brother, his brother Jeff and Papa Tom, and last October, we're standing in front of the Adam Smith Monument in Edinburgh on the Royal Mile. So we're big Adam Smith fans. I want to provide a little context. I'm going to be talking about the big picture urbanism, so we can get into the details. Pete opened with talking about Charleston, how wonderful it is. Everybody loves it. It's walkable, and it really, I think you're really talking about a small part of Charleston. Because for those of you who are not here, the peninsula, which was the city of Charleston until 1960, it's actually just south of Mount Pleasant Street, was the peninsula, roughly 2,500 acres. So today, the city is 73,000 acres. So what the city was in 1960 was less than 5% of what it is. Today, it's 5%. What was in 1960, just 5% of the total city today. And the population in 1940 to 1950 was roughly 70,000 of the peninsula. Now that same area is about 30,000. The city itself is 150,000. So Charleston is, for the most part, this just a big urban sprawl. What we know that our brand is Rainbow Row and City Hall and St. Philip's Church, but that's just a tiny portion of the overall city. Most of it is just this big urban sprawling area like you see all over the country. So I just want to set that straight. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that came to be. So this is today's opinion page of the paper. Came out this morning. If you take out the George Will and the Lowry columns, there are 10 pieces. Those were nationally oriented. There are 10 pieces related to local news. 60% of those are about growth issues, roads or urban growth boundaries or what have you. So people are really focused in on this. I got back late last night. I was invited to speak at a city in Florida, Lake Wales, that's experiencing growth challenges, and I gave a little presentation and lessons from historic cities. But I'm not going to go through that. But one of the things we discussed were cities have boundaries. And cities have had boundaries for thousands and thousands of years. Up until the 20th century, we kind of abandoned them. In biblical times, they call it God's urban design guidelines. You know, this guidelines, you've heard of the 10 Commandments, right? But he also gave these urban design guidelines. So these were the ones he gave to Moses before, as they looked over the promised land, where he said people will live in cities, they'll be surrounded by suburbs, which is what they're called in the King James Version, which will be for their beasts and their crops and things like that. And so those are God's urban design guidelines, bounded cities. Jerusalem, which is 5,000 years old, is bounded. Now, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations talked about there being 3 duties of the sovereign, of the government. And the third one highlighted here is that of the duty of erecting and maintaining public institutions and those public works, which, though they may be in the highest degree advantageous to a great society, are, however, of such a nature that the profit could never repay the expense to any individual or small number of individuals, which could therefore be expected that any individual or individuals could erect or maintain. So he says that infrastructure is one of the duties of sovereign. Now, I don't disagree completely with that, but I think you have to get more detail in which sovereign, which locality, the city, the county, the state, which government is to maintain that infrastructure. During the Constitutional Convention, this subject came up. Ben Franklin proposed that Congress be empowered to fund infrastructure. Madison then expanded that motion to say that Congress should be empowered to establish, to charter corporations, specifically banks. George Mason, among others, pushed back against that, and the states voted against it 8-3. Congress did not have that power to fund infrastructure or to charter a bank. Now, this issue came up a few years later in 1791 when Hamilton wanted to establish a bank. And Jefferson, along with Edmund Randolph and James Madison, were pushing back on that. It came before George Washington. He emphasizing the 10th Amendment, said to take a single step beyond the boundaries, thus especially drawn around the powers of Congress, is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. Of course, what happened is Washington ignored the advice of his Attorney General Randolph, Madison, and Jefferson, and embraced Hamilton's implied powers doctrine and signed the bill creating a bank. Fast forward through the 19th century, in the Communist Manifesto, one of the planks, Marx called for the abolition of a distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the countryside. So sometimes I wonder if sprawl is a communist plot. Now, the founders, I mentioned during the Constitutional Convention, they voted 8-3 against the power to fund infrastructure. That was overturned officially in 1907 in the Supreme Court's decision in Wilson versus Shaw. It's a case over the Panama Canal And they said that they recognized Congress's power to fund infrastructure. Shortly thereafter, you had the Federal Reserve Act and the Internal Revenue Act, which provided the federal government with vast new sources of wealth to do things. And shortly after that, you had the first Federal Aid Road Act in 1916. Not much happened because of World War I, but then in 1921, they passed the second one. And this provided a whole new means of funding for highways. So it happened pretty quickly. At the time, you had people like Henry Ford who were saying that and the automobile was coming along, people were buying cars. But what's different between the car and, say, a train is a railroad operator had to actually build his own railroads. So in the case of a car, we're looking to the government to do that, right? The streets are funded by government. So Ford was advocating for more and more government funding. Of course, it helped him out, right? Car is not of much use unless you have a road to drive on. And in Europe, you had other modernist architects like Corbusier, who was advocating for these. This was his vision of a contemporary city in 1922. This was before there was such a thing as interstate highways. And he said, the cities will be part of the country. I shall live 30 miles from my office, my secretary 30 miles in the other direction. We shall both have our own car, use up tires, wear out road services and gears, consume oil and gas, all of which will necessitate a great deal of work, enough for all. And then during the Roosevelt administration, you had people like Rex Tugwell, who advocated for just getting rid of the cities and going out into the countryside and tearing everything down. Oh, welcome. Here's another planner who was they were looking to Germany and the Autobahn for inspiration. This is Frederick Gutheim, a planner and academic, who said the Autobahn in Germany has made such strides in quality of design, all American efforts, despite the Titanic effort, the public works program was hopelessly lagging behind. Thomas McDonald was chief of the Bureau of Public Roads at the time, and he went over. This was when America was still on friendly terms with Germany. He went and sat down and visited with Adolf Hitler and Fritz Todt, Hitler's chief engineer at the time. They were admiring the interstate. They thought it was great. And so McDonald came back and went on a barnstorming tour and talked about how great the Autobahn highways were, and that we needed to do the same thing, except what they were doing in Germany, that was building these Autobahns around cities, and we need to build our interstates right through the middle of them. So that was the vision that they espoused in a report called Toll Roads and Free Roads in 1939. There's an image. Shifting gears back to boundaries a little bit. This is Boundary Street in Beaufort. We used to have boundaries. Our cities had boundaries. Calhoun Street was formerly called Boundary Street. This is a map of Mount Pleasant. Mount Pleasant implemented zoning in 1949. It's hard to see at the top, but that street at the top is called Boundary Street. It was renamed Simmons Street in 1958, and we abandoned this kind of traditional approach to building towns and cities. You still see these in Europe. This is on the upper left is a town in Greece. On the right, one in France. Bottom left in Austria, where you have a clear delineation between urban and rural. You enter a city, there'll be the city limit sign, you leave, it's like city not, and you're into the countryside. But so after World War II, we finally passed this vision that had been created pre-war, and we created passed the Highway Act of 1956, which funded the interstate highways and these other big highways. And so this is in Charleston, a couple of weeks after that bill passed. He started widening 17 Savannah Highway from 2 lanes to 5 lanes. Just a few shots of that. This is in Mount Pleasant, what is now Coleman Boulevard, that was widened from 2 lanes to 5 lanes using federal money. This is a headline from the Post and Courier, or the Evening Post as it was called then, from 1957. So the original plan was to stop the interstate before it got into the city. And with this plan, they advanced the idea of building it right into the heart of the city, which is what we have now. This is a presentation I saw Mayor Riley give in 2017, where he talks about moving boundaries. And I said at the beginning, before 1960, the city was just 2,500 acres. It had grown to about twice that during the 60s and 70s. When Riley took over, the city boundaries comprised about 77,000 acres, and now it's 72,000 acres, sprawled all over Daniel Allen, Kane Hoyd, Johns Allen, James Allen. It's not really the city that we know down here that Charleston has this brand of, as I said, of this historic area. It's just sprawled all over the place. Now we continue to follow this vision that was established in the early 20th century. This is a excerpt of a speech that President Obama gave in 2010. Think about this in the context of what Corbusier said in 1922. You know, we've got roads and bridges across this country that need rebuilding. So this is espousing the idea that these big giant infrastructure bills. And it's not just here, it's all over the world. This is Putin from 2013. So this is the vision that's been in place since the early 20th century that we continue to follow along. And we're kind of addicted to it, politically addicted to it. This is from 6 or 7 years ago when they passed the half sales tax program. And this shows the confusion at even the highest levels. This is Hillary Clinton's famous book from years ago. And look at her vision on the front cover of this book. This will go from this high rise along the interstate in our school bus to the village in the country. So I think it has taken our village, this kind of disease in the public mind, this new radical vision for how we build our cities. Took this picture. I wanted to get out and talk to this guy about this. This is on near my house on Cannon Street. The contractor had this. And he says there's a bumper sticker here, and I wanted to get out and ask him if he understood that he was driving on socialized road. That this is the level of, shows the level of confusion. Of course, now we have these issues with NIMBYs. But I grabbed this screenshot of this tweet from this morning. This is what happens when you try to take people's benefits away. This is in France, where Macron is trying to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64. So, choice, human scale versus inhuman scale. This is Charleston, Church Street, St. Philip's Church on the right. This is Lockwood Boulevard, built in the 60s. Charleston originally was this, when it was a walled city in the late 17th, early 18th century, 62 acres. If you go back and look and study this area, this is what exists in that 62 acres today. It's 720 homes, 800,000 square feet of commercial space, and all these civic uses, churches, theaters, 450 student schools, 6 museums, cemeteries, the city hall. The economic value in that 62 acres is over 1.5 billion. And cities traditionally have had the capacity to adapt and evolve. This is Savannah. In 1734, a year after it was settled, you see the little, on the left, you see the little cabins. And then 100 years later, how it's evolved into these elegant 3-story masonry buildings. The public realm has been embellished with brick sidewalks and monument to Nathaniel Greene in Johnson Square. So this is what can happen course, they didn't have zoning here, right? This gets a little bit to what Brad was talking about in his opening slide, but this is Ion, a neighborhood we're involved in building. These are values 25 years ago and more recently taken last year. So this is the price acceleration. It's a huge demand for walkable urbanism, a very limited supply. So the prices just go through the roof. This is another neighborhood we're involved in called Earl's Court. And just an example, that house in the lower left, which sold originally for about $600,000 in 2016 and resold last year for $1.2 million. This is on a 35th of an acre lot. And I just wanted to show a couple of pictures of cool people hanging out here. Dan Boudreau on right here in Rosewater Lane, and then you have Alat and Nolan Gray and Sonia Trouse on Rosewater Lane. So cool people come here. So I think the going forward is we need to be aware. We need to, awareness is the first step, right? So we need to acknowledge the serious problems that we have with this planning methodology, government enabled planning methodology of the last 100 years, not just enabled, but underwritten of the last century, and attempt to rethink how we build our settlements. And there's just a couple other shots about how it can be done. This is in Copenhagen, some before and after shots. So that was my remarks.
Thanks, Vince. I think several years ago, you mentioned the fact that Charleston was the same size footprint as DC and Boston put together. We have like 1/25 the population.
Right.
We do have an urban growth boundary that's not really defensible, except for political. There's no legal defense of the urban growth boundary, but it's way out there, right? And so we have all this space to fill. But the question is, what are we going to fill it with? And so maybe we can turn to you with the BAR and kind of your vision about how do you take what we love about Charleston downtown and keep that consistent throughout the entire area that our previous mayor has laid out for us, which is a large part of large area. So yeah.
I kind of knew you'd start there. So quick preamble, I am on the BAR, I'm on the BAR large specifically, but it's probably legally important for me to note that I'm not speaking for the board itself. I'm just one board member, just one jerk. And it's also important to note that the BAR is probably the most publicly forward-facing aspect of planning, zoning, and administration in the city of Charleston. It's probably the most commonly attended public meeting all of city government.
Yeah, so I wasn't saying what are you personally doing to fix Charleston, but like what is the bar? What would a bar do to help me maintain cohesiveness? I guess
almost nothing.
Yeah.
And that's because our charge is largely over the aesthetics of things.
Mm-hmm.
The city has stated political desires for a certain sort of developmental pattern in the city, but our laws don't reflect that, and never have. Even downtown, the zoning ordinance that we're beholden to as far as building setbacks and the relationships with the public rights of way and the amount of lot that can it has nothing to do with the built pattern, and it never has. And it's been contemplated for probably about 2 generations now that the city needs a massive override of the ordinance, but it's so far been politically untenable. Everyone wishes we could just continue building in the very same pattern as we have been, but it hasn't happened. And there's one other thing to it too. We have modern day garbage trucks, which they say can't drive down the streets of Ion, which they obviously do. We have modern day fire engines, which they say can't drive down the streets of the Lower Peninsula, but somehow or another they do. So there's a lot of engineering in the background of this as well, not just political will.
Yeah. I think the hardest thing for just a citizen to wrap their heads around is, no, let me start over. But one of the things that citizens don't really realize is that what they love about Charleston,
cityscapes, the streets that we all kind of go to walk around are at the human scale, and they're largely illegal today. We can't build a King Street again. Like, I mean, imagine if a developer came to the city of Charleston and said, we would like to build 2.5 miles of commercial with residential above it, right on the sidewalk, and we're going to provide no parking.
Well, that's what kills it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and this comes up a lot with the really large scale multifamily, multi-purpose projects that happen in the Upper Peninsula. Everyone's horrified by the scale of the building and the density that it represents, but it's not density of people, it's density of vehicles. And yeah, King Street is impossible because of just the parking up ordinance alone.
But it works though, but it works.
Yeah, I think it's two things though. It's one, like you're saying, Jay, we've outlawed that kind of development pattern, but we are also rapidly subsidizing sprawl. So it's two things. We're this misaligned incentives and disincentives. And people still call for, there's this great clamor for let's spend more money on roads, let's build, extend 526. And so this is proven not to work, but yet we continue to do that. So that's what I mean by we're politically addicted to the system. You try to change it, people get up in arms like they are in France about the retirement age.
What do we think that this incohesiveness of regulation does to housing prices in a city? Charleston doesn't have a monopoly on rising housing prices. Lots of cities have rising housing prices. So if we're talking about housing affordability, what is it that we can do in Charleston to maybe realign our plans, our zoning laws, our requirements on builders to maybe allow housing to come on board quicker and less and cheaper?
Do you think it makes a difference if you're talking about affordability in terms of rents or in terms of mortgages?
Well, Emily Hamilton last night at the Bastiat study event here we had right in Wells Fargo, showed a really good example of in nature. This is going to be kind of sound weird, but you have hermit crabs. She had a picture of a hermit crab, and they said they line up all in a row, and they actually do this apparently, and they coordinate, and they say, okay, the smallest hermit crab is going to move to the next size shell, the next size shell, the next size shell, and at the end, they kind of all move forward like a conga line. With smallest shell is there and available for a new hermit crab to line in. What the similarity is, what she was getting at is that we need cheap housing to buy for that first starter home. And I'm seeing less and I'm seeing less and less of that in cities these days, where you have these houses that are $150,000 and plus or lower housing. I mean, Johns Island, a Pulte neighborhood is starting at $350,000, $425,000. That's almost unattainable for a first housing. I think apartments are usually the very first housing, but the rent has to be low enough that you can save up to buy that next house. I don't think that people in Charleston can do that these days, not as much as before.
I feel like we're leaving the good professor out. He's been very patient.
I can comment when necessary. So one thing I think about a lot when people say Charleston, they think about the city of Charleston, and it is this, yeah, it hopped over the Ashley River, and now in West Ashley, you can't even tell if you're in the city or not, besides the color of your trash can. But to an economist, the city of Charleston is everything all the way up through Nexton, the metro area. We think about it's the whole labor market, if you will. And for a classical economic response is let the market do its job. And so you get this kind of weird political versus economic situation where the market response to high prices is to increase supply. But you're blocked from doing that for either regulation or zoning laws. And then another comment I have about a couple of follow-up. One thing that occurs is one of my colleagues and I had this idea, like, I'm a housing developer. I have incentive to build the nicest houses I can, not starter homes, but like really nice homes. And I think I looked at a home in West Ashley that was right next to the dump. That was for $450,000. And my wife said no, but it smelled. So that's one thing I think about. And then you also have the who holds political power in the city is the voters. And then a homeowner is like, I don't want that next to me, or that apartment complex. So they can pressure their politicians to vote for politicians who can maybe put up more restrictive housing policies. And that's great for them, but if you're trying to move to the city, it's awful. And I think I've seen stuff where like the areas where the housing prices have increased the steepest are also areas where there's most restrictions on building new homes. So
Vince, you had some experience with Morris Square, I believe, down here. You were trying to match the aesthetic and the density of the area, correct? When you did Morris Square?
I think we're trying to increase it.
Yeah, increase the density.
Mhm.
And the same thing with the entrance to Mount Pleasant. In a nutshell, how hard was it to get your vision through a city council or a zoning committee to change, or even not even for Morris Square? It wasn't really to change it too much. It was just to almost mimic the neighborhood, from what I can understand. And the regulations have drifted so far apart that took you a long time to get through those hurdles, right?
Well, that's right. I mean, it's, for the reasons y'all have already said, it's the zoning effectively outlaws this.
Yeah.
And
So before you put the first shovel in the ground, you already spent a
well,
ton of-
ION took 2 years to get approved, and then once it was approved, then it was challenged, and it took 2 more years, the case that went to the South Carolina Supreme Court before it was resolved. So, yeah, it's much easier if you're a developer to go out in Berkeley County or Dorchester, where the federal government has funded these big giant roads, and to buy a bunch of land, subdivide it, sell it to Pulte or DR Horton or Lennar, and than it is to go close in and develop close in, where the laws, as Jay said, the zoning is downtown is based on 60s, 70s, or even 30s or 40s thinking that doesn't allow that. So you have to go through this political process. It's a political campaign to gain approval.
But even with developers going out in Berkeley County and Somerville and now Ridgeville, even for looking for Volvo and workers out there, we're still in a massive shortage of housing in Charleston based on what we saw with my first graph. So we can't solve it, but what would be some ways from a developer's point of view and an economist's point of view, and even because your day job as an architect's point of view, you help project get through. What are the biggest hurdles that could be removed?
Liberalize the rules would be the biggest things. I mean, it's been started some, like we eliminated parking requirements set on King Street south of Calhoun.
Mhm.
We're allowing for more ADUs, although they're still,
ADU is an accessory
dwelling unit, like a garage apartment or something,
Mhm.
even though that's still really challenging.
Yeah.
But like where I live, a few blocks from here, maybe it's a version of the hermit crab idea, but my across the street neighbor has a house, and he has 3 little small apartments on the ground floor. He is able to do that because the city allows up to 4 unrelated people to live under the same roof. But
Mhm.
the units are kind of gray market units.
Yeah.
They're not, they wouldn't be approved if asked for that.
Is there anybody here who lives in an ADU, like an accessory dwelling unit that's near a house, like a carriage house or a first floor of a house that was converted into an apartment? No.
That's what I mean. It's 60% of American households are composed of 1 or 2 people. So we got lots of building area.
Mhm.
And the average new house in 1960 was like 1,000 or 1,100 square feet.
Yeah.
Today it's 2,400 square feet, even though the average household size in 1960 was 3.5, and today it's 2.5.
So if liberalizing the rules is the answer, what's stopping us from liberalizing the rules? Is it the fear of trusting people to build responsibly? I'll put that to
Actually,
Jay and to Chris as well.
That fear comes up, but I don't think it's really well founded. the rules or the design principles that an entity like the Board of Architectural Review don't really, and this is going to sound shocking to a lot of people, they don't really ask that much.
Yeah.
What asks a lot is the zoning ordinance, and some of it's dead necessary. Like we had a long conversation today in the studio about the city's stormwater ordinance, which everyone is horrified by, but we've got to do something, and they are attempting to do something. It's something vital. But I think there could be a lot to be found by just building in the pattern that was proven to work in the 19th century. But I used to teach a seminar on architecture and politics at Clemson, and I used to end the course by asking if the city of Charleston is so beautiful, then how in the hell did they build it without a BAR?
Yeah.
And it's not because there wasn't a BAR.
Yeah.
It's because we had a different pattern of living that we find really appealing, but also very inconvenient.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great for us to say, it's just like build up, parking minimums, but most developers will tell you, is like, how in the hell am I going to rent these apartments if there's no parking associated with them?
Yeah, that seems to be a strange blindness for regulators, is to think that a developer would build a house without a driveway on accident, or like they obviously put some thought into that, right? You had this with Ion, right? I mean, your neighbors in Ion were worried about a parking problem 15 years ago or so, and there wasn't a parking problem, it was just a perceived parking problem. But it would be really strange for an apartment complex to go up without thinking first about parking, whether it's their own if there's no parking nearby, or using the parking stock that's around. So I don't think most people will trust a developer enough to allow that to happen. So they put parking minimums in place, they put setbacks in place.
A lot of those, I think, are just color that their impediments put in the way that are not real. I mean, it's but if you can put these extra hurdles in front of a developer, that makes it harder to do.
Yeah.
So it's I think there is a natural tendency. So home is a very emotional issue, right? So home is very emotional. It's also, yeah, it's also most people, most of their wealth is tied up in their home. So it's a financial issue too. And we've created it's in a individual homeowner's best interest to be against housing, because it would limit supply, right? And thereby put upward pressure on their values. And then they also, the way things are built, the way the roads are built, where there's not a street network, but these big arterials and stuff. So people think, well, every house that comes in is going to add to the traffic problem.
So is real change going to happen with a different public opinion on how to fix the housing stock? I mean, an acceptance of more apartments, an acceptance of different levels of housing quality, Chris?
I was gonna say, one thing that hasn't been discussed is the rate at which cities evolve. And so we all live, we live our day-to-day lives, and we want, I need a new house. I got like 6 months to find one or something. But the evolution of a city takes years. Put up a house, probably going to stand for 50, 60 years. A big building downtown might stand for 70, 80 years before they bring it down. And so there's for a city, there's this long adjustment process that takes many years to play out, but we want it to occur immediately. And so back to another, again, one of the original questions, what can the government do, or what can we do? So I was talking with a colleague today, and usually to get developers to build affordable housing, they have to be subsidized somehow, a low income, some type of subsidy tax credit. And he was telling me that the state of South Carolina has done a bad job of providing the right incentives for developers to build such housing. I think that could be a potential policy option there. They had some type of tax credit for building single family homes that were like 1,500 square feet.
What that presupposes is that building affordable housing is not profitable. And right, so we had to subsidize them to build an affordable house. And so the real problem is, why is it not profitable to build an affordable house?
The dirt.
We have lots of dirt in Charleston.
I know, but the dirt that you want to use for affordable housing so that people can be walkable,
Yeah.
it's very expensive dirt.
Does anybody have any questions here from the audience?
So. A lot of, all the things that we've been talking about are not unique to Charleston.
No.
Rising house prices, sprawl, right? Cheap infrastructure that allows the sprawl and all of these things, right? Affordable housing. But what is unique to Charleston, right, is this where we are scalable, right? And the rules that we have in historic preservation. So there are lots of places, Chris and I have talked about this, where you have houses that fall either under the bar or maybe under the 75-year rule that still have to be approved by parties if they're not in the historic district. Then we get one of two things, it seems like. Either you invest a lot and you build it out into something really nice, which is expensive, or as we were mentioning just before this, right? It's demolition by neglect, right? And so where we're having that second, right? Where is the reasonable line to say, I was pointing out some of my colleagues earlier, right? This little facade over on Wentworth Street that no one is allowed to tear down and build onto it, right? But it's being held up and shored up and so forth, right? As you said, that's a very expensive piece of dirt, right? Again, this may not be necessarily, but specifically here in Charleston, right? There are opportunities and ways in which we could be using rocks much better because of historical preservation and restoration things that are that go beyond all the other problems you're talking about. So I wonder if y'all want to maybe just get on some of those issues.
I was thinking about renting that building.
It's cheap for the moment. If you bring your own tent.
Is historic preservation valuable? At a certain time, we just said, this is what we're going to preserve. We're going to make Charleston a museum. Charleston evolved every day of its life until we decided, all right, this is it. This is what we want it to look like forever and ever. Amen.
Well, I think that's an unintended consequence of people's interpretation of preservation ordinances. Because the city of Charleston has one of the oldest preservation ordinances in the country, if not the oldest.
I think it's the oldest district.
And it was never intended to ossify the place. That's more a function of changing demographics and economics and anything else. But we wouldn't even be having this discussion about the expensive nature of Charleston real estate had it not been for those decisions. You know, and there are other, you know, massively significant infrastructure decisions that were made in the 19th century that improved our chances too. There was a moment in time where it was anticipated that the new rail line would go all the way down to Market Street. And it was an early act of preservation in the antebellum era to decide not to do that because it would disturb the neighborhoods. And that's how you end up with the Mesquite-Ragsboro Garden District, which is one of the more expensive neighborhoods. I don't think our preservation ordinances make it more expensive to live downtown, except for the fact that it's made that these acres more precious because they're more unique. And if you have a house downtown, no one from the city is going to say, you know, we expect that in the next 18 months, you're going to spend top dollar to make this thing look like a museum house. We just don't want you to let it fall in. Like the bar is actually relatively low. And when the city gets to prosecuting a demolition by neglect, the thing hasn't been livable for a decade.
Yeah.
And is a public hazard at that point.
Questions from our Zoom audience. The first one is, any thoughts on the proposed union pier development?
Well, I think it's a huge opportunity for the city. For those who don't know, Union Pier is a port facility owned by the State Ports Authority, and they've recently decided to sell that. And they've been going through a planning exercise. It's roughly 70 acres, of which 40 acres is highland developed. It's on the east side on the Cooper River. And the plan is to extend the street network, create a public park along the waterfront. Big concern is the density and the scale of it. Jay, you can probably talk a lot more about that, which I share the concerns of the scale anyway. I'm a huge proponent of density. But the buildings that you see At West Edge, coming over the Ashley River Bridge, the big medical center buildings, the new building is at Morrison Yards at the end of these kind of, monolithic buildings that could be anywhere in the United States. For me personally, I'm not fond of those. I prefer the smaller scale buildings that you see further south in Charleston.
Smaller scale, but dense, but still dense.
Very dense, yeah.
Yeah.
But
We have-
like
we have-
5-6 story versus 8-10.
We have three massive projects really in Charleston. The Union Pier is a big project. Magnolia, what's it called? The Magnolia project. It's like 10,000 homes or 10,000 people could live there. Essentially, I was a number that I heard. And then Nexton way up in Ridgeville. Very different projects.
Yeah.
Right.
One factor that is influential in Magnolia and Union Pier is that those are formerly industrial sites and the soils are in poor shape.
Right.
The federal regulations to clean those up sufficient to allow single family residential is, as I understand it.
That was the barrier for 30 years or so. And Magnolia is that big piece of property when you're leaving on 26 and you look to your left-hand side and you think, why isn't that amazing piece of land on the Ashley River not been developed? Well, it's an industrial like waste site.
Because it's saturated with carcinogens.
Yeah. So they finally had a grant to remediate that, and
it's
they're
a
going to be
super
building
fun
it.
site.
So yeah, but it's
And West Edge is the same way.
Yeah.
That's
Oh,
why
yeah.
that was, because it would have been conceivable to take West Edge and just extend the west side, just build
All
more
the way.
streets and build more single family.
Yeah.
Can't do it.
Any other we have a question here in the audience.
Hi, I'm from Winston-Salem, and like a lot of suburban cities or sprawling cities in the south, getting these big developments, they go into these 2-lane feeder roads and make that potentially block traffic. And one thing I don't understand, somebody who goes to England a lot, you see these villages, and every village has a little square, they have a grocery store, they have this little mini retail outlet center. And why are these developments having some sort of equivalent small store rather than everybody having to go all the way down to the grocery store and kind of alleviate some of that these traffic problems? Wouldn't that be attractive for people?
I think so, but the thing is that a lot of those places are not as accommodating to the automobile as we are. Because you can have a corner store, that's fantastic, but if you can just hop in the car, back out of the driveway, and 10 minutes later you're at Target, you'll bypass the corner store every time. Unless you're committed to the corner store.
Yeah, I was just thinking some of these developments, and I've seen some of them, like there's one around top of Mothorpe like that is extremely popular because they have sidewalks, the houses are go right up to the sidewalk. They're kind of mimicking Charleston look. And they will movie theater and all that, and then really popular. I'm just not understanding why they didn't find that.
Well, because it's illegal to do.
Yeah. How
To make the small retail work, you have to have density to work. And so the cities you reference in England, the UK passed a Town and Country Act after World War II, where they're very careful about, again, the boundaries that I talked about earlier, preserving those boundaries and not just building roads out into the middle of the countryside and having given away access to it.
And our zoning, right? I mean, zoning laws sometimes will prohibit.
Yeah, I don't know enough
retail
about-
space near a residential
Yeah,
space.
Alan, Sandy might be able to talk about the zoning more, but in England, I'm not that.
Are there any other questions from in the room before we go to the? Yeah.
Perspective of someone who lives downtown, I do pass quite a few places there like, wow, that is abandoned and, could be there and used somewhere else. I'm just curious what you guys thought would be from the city's perspective and then to like the market's perspective of how to come together and actually get things done and make this, either abandoned or, non-useful land or locations actually turn into something useful or housing or something like that. Like, for example, on Calvary Street, right across from NUSC, there's a white square that looks like there should be a giant building there.
The bar cannot comment on that. I can tell you that much.
No comments at this time.
Well, did we kind of gloss over what demolition by neglect means and why it sometimes is the road taken? Do we want to do we have time to dive into that?
Well, you want to at least explain why you're not going to
Well,
comment on
so
that?
that big blank spot, it has been a quite contentious multifamily proposal. The address is 295 Calhoun Street. It's an active application before VAR, so I'm not going to talk about it for obvious reasons, but the facts are that they've proposed 4 iterations of that design, actually 5, and 4 of them have been outright denied by the board with the request to completely reconfigure the proposal, and that is an ongoing saga. Now, as far as what demolition by neglect is, it's most of the time in Charleston, demolition by neglect is closely tied to the issue of heirs property, where there's no clear title due to inheritance. And it usually is a property that is within the boundaries of the historic district that has absentee ownership. It has fallen into a state of disrepair that is no longer viable as a rental unit, and so it just continues to decline, either with the intended or unintended consequence that it just simply collapsed into the street. They scraped it away and now they have a clean lot. Sometimes it is a matter of pure economic hardship on behalf of the property owners. Sometimes it's a calculated development strategy, and it's very hard to determine which is which.
I think we have to wrap by 4, correct? So we have time for one 30-second question and answer. Okay.
What is your, I can't remember, opinion on short-term rentals, their impact on housing in Charleston?
Yeah, that's going to be part 2 of our conversation. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Sometimes the board does deal with that sort of thing, but the heights of buildings are largely imposed with only a little bit of latitude by the zoning ordinance. So if you're in a district that says you can have a 6-story building, then the board has the ability to allow that 6-story building. We have the ability to allow a 6.5-story building, or we can knock it down to 5.5, and that's it. So those heights are really regulated by zoning. The city hired planners about 7 years ago to completely reconsider all of that across the entire city.
Yeah, so the zoning is how big and where, and then the bar is what does that look like once the developer has an investment in mind, right?
Right.
Yeah.
We're gonna take the prerogative and ask one last quick question. When you take the bar and you add it to zoning, how much worse do we get?
Worse than what? Just having zoning by itself?
The average city, right? Zoning is a problem everywhere, right? So if we take zoning and we add it to the bar, does that really complicate things, or is that kind of negligible? And is it really, should we put more of the blame on zoning? The bar may not be all that much to blame, but in other words, if we put those 2 things together, is that really just sort of magnify the problem?
So that would be an interesting question to pose to my business partner, Andy, who's back in the back corner. We practice all over the South. And I guess my general take is that the city of Charleston's regulations are not made more labyrinthine purely because of the VAR, but because of an overall bureaucratic sludge that permeates all of city government. And I say that as an appointed public official. It's something that we talk about a lot. But the requirements of the VAR are not inscrutable. Like, it's written out. You can, like, we even have a little chart. You do these things, easier to prove. You do these things, harder to prove. We made it as clear as possible without dictating design, which is an important feature of the VAR, is that it's not a form-based code. We don't dictate whether you have a pitch roof or a flat roof or a gambrel roof or whatever.
Does anyone know how many Charlestonians it takes to change a light bulb?
I do, but I want you to tell the joke.
Change?
No, the joke that I heard is well, 100, 1 to change the light bulb, but 99 to stand around and talk about how grand the old bulb was. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for that panel.
Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. We will again continue to be having our events. We will be back in Wells Fargo Auditorium this evening at 6 o'clock. Dr. Cindy Pia will be talking to us about Jay Jacobs and learning economics and social theory from her. You've probably heard Jay Jacobs mentioned a few times in this discussion. So I encourage you all to come out. Thank you for coming. Again, if you want to learn more about this,
No, it's not.
please.